combat in MMORPGs is often one of the first features of the game that you will experience, and yet oddly enough it's a feature that unlike other genres seems to go unnoticed at times. MMORPGs combat has rarely ever been a huge focus in games. Usually the prescription of, well, it's good enough, has been, well, good enough. But I wanted to make a video that analyzed the different combat systems currently present in MMORPGs, and often a discussion as to which combat system could or might be the better or best system moving forward, as well as the flaws of either system from the player or developmental perspective. As a quick primer, the combat systems in particular we will be talking about are tab target systems, as present in most MMORPGs but most known in the king of MMOs, World of Warcraft. Action combat systems are next on the docket, popular in games such as Black Desert Online, Vindictus, and Terra. And then finally we will touch upon the little hybrid marriage between the two, as showcased in games such as Arcade or Guild Wars 2. Let's waste no more time and get into our first topic, tab target systems in MMORPGs. Tab target combat systems are our oldest form of major combat system across MMORPGs. From the very humble beginnings of our first 3D MMOs to the later launched blockbuster titles, it's a staple in the world of MMOs. There's no question why, really. The MMORPG market with its humble beginnings needed to craft a combat system that could properly hold up netcode-wise. Action combat systems simply wouldn't have worked realistically with the aging tech of the first couple of MMOs. But as technology advanced, we still find ourselves held hostage by the tab target combat system. Nearly 2 decades later after it was first implemented, the tab target system is still the most prevalent combat system. There are a couple things that demonstrate a tab target system. I will explain what features you would commonly find within. I will also detail a number of reasons why it's both good and bad for the genre. Tab target systems are a staple because they offer the most consistent experience for a wide range of players. Pings and performances of all different kinds will generally have the same consistent gameplay experience. So whether you are playing from China, Europe, or America, you can all play at relatively the same similar performance level. It should also be said that tab target systems by the same token would be cheaper and easier to implement on. You wouldn't need as much server infrastructure, engine ability, or anything of that sort. Not to mention it's far safer to implement a tab target system as it requires far less coding and creates far less potential headaches. There's a bit of the whole idea of being too comfortable though, as most MMORPG players are quite familiar with the tab target system. This is actually a big criticism of mine. I think tab target has worked and has been a staple, thus when MMORPGs are launching with already large budgets and potential consequences for failure, it's simply easier to go with the tried and true methods. But this as a trend overall stifles growth and innovation, as not many companies are brave enough to try and innovate within the tab target genre too much. I'm not asking for big sweeping changes, especially when the system clearly works, but minor upgrades and innovations here and there can really help things out. Before I go into pros and cons of the tab target system, let's take a look at a few MMOs that do tab target right. World of Warcraft, of course, we have to go to the most popular MMORPG of all time first. The reason why tab target is perfect for WoW, besides it being the easiest to pick up combat system, is that it offers a lot of variety of skills. It doesn't take a whole lot of effort to find targets and attack, as you can just literally press tab to target automatically. WoW has a plethora of classes, each with unique mechanics and unique selling points. While the warrior might rely on the typical rage mechanic, as well as a plethora of CC and burst opportunities, classes such as the Druid allow for switching between forms such as healing forms, DPS forms, and tank forms. These all offer different abilities. The skill cap in such a game isn't really as much about reaction or aim. Most projectiles and ranged abilities aren't aimed, they're auto-locked, but more about planning, as well as playing with and against cooldowns properly. It's more about knowledge. In Final Fantasy XIV, another tab target game, the combat is slower than most games, allowing for more technical and strategic play versus spamming abilities. In a tab target game, you're generally not going to be afraid of just being purely aimed down, such as you might in another Blizzard title, such as like Overwatch to some extent. A really good Widowmaker or McCree can kill you relatively quickly. Now in MMOs, this is in part due to healing in tab target games being far more potent than other combat systems, as it's mostly auto-locked so you're not going to miss heals. But make no mistake though, there is absolutely a skill cap in tab target combat systems. It's just less about mechanics and far more about timing, knowledge, and positioning. Having a depth of knowledge in a team composition, as well as knowing specific matchups, is an important thing in a tab target PvP MMO. Did you lose a 1v1 due to not properly knowing a matchup, or perhaps your team didn't properly plan or utilize their team comp properly? Whereas in PvE, it's more about your knowledge of fights and your positioning. Were you out of position and died to a boss? Did you forget about the boss's ability and it resulted in your death? Etc. Now to get to the pros and cons of the tap target combat system, the pros are easy to pick up for players of all skill levels. Knowledge and experience is often the best indicator of skill versus mechanical ability. Tap target is the safest combat type to use in an MMO for a plethora of reasons. There's a lot more cross-realm or cross-region compatibility because the game's not so ping reliant, as well as it's also a proven system, so it's much safer to rely on, the tried and true. Tap target usually has more classes or build diversity due to not having to focus so much on aimed auto attacks. It's easier for those to play who struggle with, well, aiming abilities. And it should be said that the most popular MMO in the world uses the tap target combat system. And one of the best things about tap target is that you are rewarded for picking the best strategic decision at the right time. Now, cons of the system are as follows. Limiting in execution by not allowing projectiles or abilities to be aimed, it inherently lowers the skill and activeness of the game mechanically. Tap target games usually lack friendly fire, which makes Zergs that much more powerful. Due to the game being more knowledge dependent, a meta develops around the gameplay and kind of constrains it to some extent. Being the most popular combat system means that the market starts to get stale after a while, as everyone else wants to try the same exact system. Tap target can also lead to more boring kinds of gameplay where you don't feel as engaged due to lacking that visceral feel that you get with combat present in action games. And finally, rotations can make classes seem overly simple and rigid at times. That's because, well, at any given time, you're generally going to have the highest percentage move that you should be doing based on the tactical situation, whereas in a game where you can have more mechanical ability, sometimes just being the better player is the solution. Action combat as a combat system, by comparison, is far newer, and was actually pioneered by Eastern MMOs from the Asian countries. If you want to be technical, the first action combat system was present in a game named Underlight and came out in 1998, but since no one has probably ever heard of that game, it's much easier to look at the Asian market, which is quite obviously the innovator in regards to action combat titles. We can likely look to Korean-born MMORPGs like Vindictus as a pioneer in the field of the action combat system. Vindictus is very unique in that although it's the first major action combat MMORPG, it's quite brazen as such. It has little to no auto-lock combat, no tab targeting, and attacks can be easily missed. Although we will call some MMORPG combat systems action combat, think of action combat systems as more of a gradient. Vindictus would be on the higher end of that spectrum, accomplishing a true action combat system complete with combos, aimed auto attacks, no tab target systems, and even destructive environments, which affect gameplay. The biggest markers of an action combat system are simple. No tab targeting system, making you have to actually aim your abilities. Depending on what type of action combat system, because if you remember me referring to it as a gradient, this is why. Some action combat systems have what you would call a soft hitbox, which means it accounts for possible latency and is a loose form of aiming, and essentially rewards the player with a hit as long as they were looking at the direction of their opponent. On the other end of the spectrum, such as Vindictus we just mentioned, aiming is far more of a hard box than a soft box in nature, which requires you to actually be frame perfect in some instances. But it can actually get even further on the spectrum in terms of action combat on the furthest end of the spectrum in indie failed MMO, Darkfall Online, which had a real physics engine and everything including heals were aimed in that game, with a near Quake level of combat and physics. If you weren't pixel perfect, you missed in Darkfall. But Darkfall's system had its obvious negatives as well. As soon as ping started to change, you saw a lot of inconsistencies in gameplay. Now I believe these are legitimate reasons for not having a true action combat MMO. To go the other direction on the spectrum, you have the more popular MMOs such as Terra Online and Black Desert Online, which have similar combats in that they emphasize soft hitboxes instead of hard hitboxes. They are more forgiving overall in terms of action combat, but still fulfill many of the same qualities previously mentioned. Focuses on reaction-based combos that favor reflexes over planning or knowledge, usually favor having a lower ping, which can make it unfortunate for those without. Combat unfortunately seems more spammy than a tab target game due to the fact that you literally have to spam mouse click in order to swing on most mobs, whereas tab target games can sometimes have rotations even at early levels. Gameplay is often riddled with mini gap closers, dashes, or sprint abilities, which is a stark contrast to the slower, more positional basis of a tab target game. These aforementioned movement abilities are typically seen as action-y and thus plague every action combat system, sometimes to near excessive levels. So let's talk about the pros and cons of the action combat system in an MMORPG. Pros. So an action combat system is going to feel more visceral. You're going to feel more engaged with each of your swings, and it's likely going to excite you more, at least get the blood flowing more. Combat animations are often more grandiose. That plus good action sounds make combat feel like an action game instead of your traditional MMO. It helps remove the monotony of most MMOs combat in regards to how slow they tend to be, especially at lower levels. Combat ultimately is more mechanically intensive, and thus a higher skill cap around things like movement, aim, and etc. Now the cons for such a system, it's harder to code, especially when you have more than a dozen characters on screen. Darkfall, for example, had tremendous issues with netcode lag, making for a very inconsistent game in regards to ping and latency. Such a game is more expensive to engineer, especially due to animations. Because of such, most action games are limited in their abilities or their class choice. Sometimes combat can feel quite spammy due to less abilities and reliance on mouse clicks. And action combat systems are littered with movement abilities to the point where some fights are literally just 90% dashing and 10% fighting. Now I figured it'd be worth mentioning some of the systems that I would describe as being a hybrid combat, so the next bit is going to be talking about that specifically. The hybrid combat systems in Guild Wars 2 and Elder Scrolls Online come to mind. These two games are mixtures of the tab target and action combat systems. We could argue that they are a natural progression to some extent, but I don't think that they are exactly better than either system yet. More like a different version of what was there before. These two games utilize action combat like animations with a more tab target oriented style of combat. Aiming is also very action oriented. Though both games heavily use softboxes, they don't feel as action-like as titles I have mentioned before, such as Vindictus, Darkfall, Terra, or BDO. Both games, instead of offering actual dodging that would be common in a game with a hard aim box, they focus more on invuln dodges which suit the more softbox style of aiming. In the case of Elder Scrolls, much of this is also because the game allows for cross-platform play, so they can't really afford to do a full action combat system and be fair to consoles at the same time. So we've talked about the tab target games and their negatives and positives, as well as the action combat games and their negatives and positives, as well as touched briefly on the hybrid combat systems present. But what are my personal thoughts on which combat system I think is better overall, and perhaps which is best moving forward? Let's start with the tab target system. It's the oldest and most used combat system, and this shouldn't surprise anybody. You would think that this translates at this point to it being quite diverse as a combat system, but I would actually argue the opposite. By using the tab target combat system, an MMO can circumvent having to spend a lot of money or focus on their combat system in favor of other sorts of content. I think developers frankly have been lazy with tab target. It's a tried and true method that many game developers have chosen as their combat system with little variety or innovations. I would say the two best cases of tab target MMOs evolving are probably ArcheAge and Blade & Soul, which in my opinion have very well versed tab target combat systems that also have the right kind of action combat feel to them. They still manage to have the complexity of a traditional tab target game while also borrowing the more action elements from an action genre. Top marks for me. I love the complexity present in tab target games, specifically around the meta and the way it develops, but the unfortunate part of this as well is that the game becomes very rigid, as not many tab target MMORPGs can manage to have a multitude of classes with all of their own usefulness. Some classes end up just being straight better, and that makes certain classes just useless or less effective. And since there's relatively no mechanical skill, it means if you play the wrong build or the wrong class in a tab target game, you are just flat out not going to do as well, even if played at a really high level. And with action combat titles, I find them typically lacking in overall meta or depth of play versus a tab target game. Not to mention the majority of action combat MMOs we have gotten so far use very scaled down action combat systems. If you remember the gradient that I mentioned earlier, many of these games use a more softbox or a casual end of the spectrum of combat, whereas we have seen very few games introduce a physics-based action combat game. Think Jedi Academy or Unreal Tournament. And that's where I sort of end up in the discussion of which is better. I still think the action combat MMO market is quite new, and there is tons of room for growth, just like there was for the tab target system. I would think it's better for us to trust in the action combat system for the future, more so than tab target, because I mean really, tab target became a staple because of the lack of technology at the time. As tech has advanced and continues to advance, we should look to more improvements to what we currently have in regards to combat. And the good news overall is based on looking at the upcoming Kickstarter MMOs that are yet to launch, it seems like most if not all are trending towards more of an action combat system versus a tab target system, and that leaves the future seeming quite appetizing for me. It's a trap for us to keep overly relying on tab target combat systems as this stifles our growth. Unless an MMORPG is going to take the tab target system with new innovations and try and innovate, like I said in the case of Blade & Soul or ArcheAge, I just hope as a genre, MMORPGs will continue to evolve and we will have newer, more exciting combat styles on the horizon. Thank you for watching, guys.